This is my first video on reading a book, and I'm starting with Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. I've read quite a few books, but I've always ignored certain classics. This is one of them. I want to say this plainly. This video isn't about proving that Jane Eyre is important, because obviously this book has survived almost two centuries. Clearly it doesn't need my help. This is for anyone who's ever loved stories but felt like the classics were somehow off limits or unattainable. Maybe they've been made to feel like certain books aren't meant for them because they're either too dense or too academic, or just like my attitude back then was too not for me. Like, that's just not for me, which is totally bull crap. And when it comes to the classics, I feel like there's more than one or two nuggets sitting in these pages. All right. I think anybody can read them. I think if you're struggling with literacy, or you are at a certain level and you want to get better, I don't think a classic is beyond you. It might take you a little bit longer to read through it, but that's part of the joy. When I wanted to start this video, I was going to break it up into thirds of the book, and then put all of those either 3 videos or 1 video. But I got to chapter 9 and I thought, there's way too much I have to say about this that I like, so I'm gonna go through it the way I'm going through it. I'm definitely not meeting any sort of quota when it comes to books to review, but I kind of want to just enjoy this with you guys. I want to bridge a gap that was difficult to bridge in ages before us, between people who love the classics and people who are curious, but maybe they're a little intimidated, between the sentiment of I should understand this and oh wow, I really feel this. I believe we live in the information age and the technological age where the discourse surrounding AI is at its potential apex. That could be a little, yeah, that could be an ambitious statement, but like right now the discourse is pretty bad surrounding AI, and AI is not going anywhere. So we need to learn how to adapt and use it responsibly and all the other things, right? That's a whole other conversation. We have so much information at our fingertips that it's a shame to give all our precious time and attention to social media brain rot. Sure, a scroll or two for 20 minutes or a little bit more, maybe like 2 hours, it won't hurt anybody, right? But our brains should be nourished with a variety of seasoned geniuses to counter the social media brain rot, right? So this video is simply meant for discussing and reading Jane Eyre slowly, lovingly, in pieces. Not to rush, not to prove anything, but to linger, to notice the vocabulary, the prose, the craft, the psychology, and the spirit of what Charlotte Brontë is actually trying to say. I could only be so fortunate to be able to get all of that in one sitting of Jane Eyre. I might, if I fall in love with this book, I might read it more than once. We'll look at moments that might seem small, or a scene that feels like it's dragging, which I can't. Nothing is dragged so far. I mean, I'm not that far in it, but like I'm a quarter way through it. Yeah, maybe not quite a quarter, but almost a quarter of the way through it. Not dragging at all. But if you're not paying attention, or if you're skimming, or if you're wondering why the heck any of this matters anyway, I want to talk about why scenes like Jane and Helen Burns talking in the courtyard aren't so small at all. I'll read some of my favorite passages aloud and maybe even break them down and explore how language has changed a bit. It's changed a lot, and I'm not gonna lie, I wrote down some vocabulary words that I've read and seen before, but I never bothered to look them up. And I understood them in the text that I was reading at the time, just by context. But in the spirit of reading this book, the way I'm reading it, I wrote them down and I looked them up so that I could understand that sentence, that passage, exactly as she intended it to be understood. Or at least read. Definitely understood. I want to think about why a novel written nearly 200 years ago can feel unsettlingly familiar in the world we're living in now. I'm living proof of someone who doesn't need to be an expert to enjoy Bronte's masterpiece, and she's a wonderful exercise in building those active reading muscles. The only thing we need is curiosity and a willingness or an open mind to sit with a sentence long enough to let it speak back. They're speaking to me all over the place. I don't know about you guys, but it's working for me. I want to sit with her writing long enough to show me a world beyond anything in front of me, because we're seeing it or we're experiencing it from within. And that shared moment was given to us by another human who lived, another human who loved, another human who wrote fervently and passionately in the moors in the 19th century. I said the moors on purpose because we're talking about the deep depths of her soul and that whole world that she was writing about. I'm already cojones deep in the psyche there. I don't know if literacy is dying. It's definitely going through something right now, and I'm beginning to think that it's quietly becoming a subculture, and that scares me. Because once upon a time, literacy was reserved for the aristocrats or the privileged or men. And now I'm starting to believe that literacy is a choice. You can be lower class, you can be working class, you can be couch hopping, and just about everybody has a smartphone in their hand, which means they have all that they could ever want to know, relatively speaking, at their fingertips. That's powerful. And I think people 100, 200, 300 years ago, if they had had access to information the way that we do, their world would have just been completely blown, their minds blown. And the fact that some of us actively choose to be ignorant, it's mind-boggling to me. So in the spirit of the Brontë sisters, yes, they had an older brother, but I'm focused on the Brontë sisters right now. In the spirit of the Brontë sisters, I think it's a woman's duty to her feminine ancestors to maintain a healthy brain that loves to read actively and deeply. And it doesn't have to have anything to do with spice. I'm not saying that spice doesn't have its place. It absolutely does have its place. However, I want to read a story that makes me long for the love that I'm reading without one squirt or throb. You know what I'm saying? I don't feel like I'm out of stepping out. Listen, a lot of these books are in the YA section. That's a young adult. That's like teenagers. If my daughter was 16, 15 years old trying to read some ACOTAR stuff, I'd be like, here, honey, read this first. You know what I mean? Like, come on. Anyway, not to crap on spice. I'm not crapping on spice. I'm just saying, let's balance here, okay? Like, I can't just look at naked people doing weird things to each other, slipping around all over the place, and feel like I can take on the world. I mean, maybe if I was 20, but still, you have to you can feed your body, but you have to feed your intellect as well. So anyway, this is my invitation to share this experience. You don't have to be a lady or feminine presenting or covering my bases. You don't have to be of the feminine or femme persuasion to join me in reading Jane Eyre. You can be anything and everything. You can also grab your pets, grab your plants, your favorite lovey, and let's sit with Charlotte Bronte's prose. Let's stay with it. Let's read together. I promise your brain will love it, your heart will appreciate it, and your soul hopefully will be ignited. Okay, Jane Eyre, chapters 1 through 3. Go. So I wrote this. So I'm quoting her. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. I like the opening sentence because we're given the quick impression that this might be a bad thing for the people or the protagonists of our story, but we quickly learn that Jane can't stand the long walks in the cold, and she describes in detail the things she doesn't like about it. And as I got through the story, I couldn't help but wonder if that represented the coldness she continuously encounters throughout the following chapters. I feel like her aversion to the cold is the aversion to her treatment there with her family and the loneliness of losing her parents, even if she was a baby when they passed away. As we see a level of separateness Jane experiences from the rest of her family, though it's not by choice. And very early on in the story, Charlotte Brontë wastes no time in setting the scene and the tone, and all through the eyes of this lovely 10-year-old Jane. We get the first inklings of Jane's internal struggle of wanting to belong. She wants warmth, but she's also finding her only peace when she's alone and in her books. And she's deprived of love and affection, and at best she receives pity from the housemate Bessie, which I absolutely love Bessie. One thing I did notice is that Charlotte Brontë refers to the weather and time as winter, but Jane is in fact in the middle of November. And maybe it's a time period thing or a Victorian era thing, or both. I can't imagine Novembers in Brontë country are much like Novembers for the folks near the equator. But I wanted to read this passage. Fold of scarlet drapery shut in my view to the right hand. To the left were the clear panes of the glass, protecting but not separating me from the drear November day. At intervals, while turning over the leaves in my book, I studied the aspect of that winter afternoon. Afar, it offered a pale blank of mist and cloud. Near, a scene of wet lawn and storm-beat shrub, with ceaseless rain sweeping away wildly before a long and lamentable blast. It's beautiful. Clearly, I'm not picking at this so much as I'm genuinely curious. It may not be winter proper, but it's evident the world, and certainly Jane's emotions, her world, feels wintry at that moment. I also wanted to point out how purposeful her choice of words were when she wrote my book. This book was Jane's escape from everything, of course, but it doesn't belong to her. And as John Reed will soon remind her, it's little details like this that she's so expertly woven into the prose that bring Jane's situation more into focus. Even the few things that she finds solace in, they aren't hers, and the words even mirror her emotional state, and her feelings of alienation are solidified by the notions and the behavior of her cousin John in chapter 1. The weather, John's treatment of her, the coldness of her aunt and Abbott, the passages in her book, they all bring us closer to Jane and her immediate situation and her frame of mind. And one of the little passages that she reads in the book that sings to her soul, and she kind of mentions, like, I don't know why it makes me feel this way, but I understand it and it speaks to me. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. It says, where the northern ocean in vast swirls boils round the naked melancholy isles of the farthest Thule, and the Atlantic surge pours in among the stormy, let's find out, Hebrides, and the Atlantic surge pours in among the stormy Hebrides. I like the whole passage. After that bit that she reads, it's the whole page that I fell in love with. I read it like twice before I continued. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read it here, but feel free. It's like on page 3. So anyway, it really isn't one of a child overreacting, though the language can be dramatic, and I found myself laughing, not laughing at Jane, but just kind of like, oh. So yeah, she's not overreacting, and it's why this articulation speaks to her soul, and not the intellect of a 10-year-old girl, because there's this fierce beauty inside this delicate little person. Her sacrifices, her sadness, her winter death, she mentions in here. A storm boils within her. She is that northern ocean, just as it is separate from her. And yeah, these words are reflecting the unforgiving world around her as well. The death white realms, within the death white realms, Jane is the rock standing up alone in a sea of billow and spray. It's very beautiful. I think Charlotte Brontë gives us information about the world in Jane through Jane's interpretation of the books she reads and the wintry world she sees outside her window behind the scarlet drapery. It also foreshadows the altercation with her cousin in the remainder of the chapter. It's really terrible, actually. This chapter also reminded me of how important storytelling is for the human psyche and how much it has been a part of our lives throughout the ages. And even though we still love stories today, it's difficult not to see how detached we've become when it comes to how we bond in the act of storytelling. How many parents and caregivers in this day and age take the time to sit down and tell stories to their children? More often than not, I see children glued to their parents' phones or tablets covered in brightly colored cases. I mean, for millennials, it was the boob tube, and maybe Xennials and Gen X too. I feel like there's this little pocket between Gen X and millennials that they kind of, it was like a weird turn for technology, but also if you fall in that Xennial pocket, you probably didn't have access to technology and computers and video games even, unless you lived in a pretty well-off family, or at least like definitely middle class. But if you were any type of economically challenged, you were still in Gen X world, right? Gen X, Xennial, millennials, we were definitely like boob tube kids, I guess. Video games too, but you still had your consoles. You didn't have a lot of handheld ones. But for Gen Z and Gen Alpha, it's so much worse. There are 2 scenes within this chapter alone that speaks to the children gathering around Bessie or Mrs. Reed for story time. However, the latter Jane is excluded from because Mrs. Reed is a total see you next Tuesday. So it's only fitting that John Reed is a little tyrant and Charlotte Brontë does a really good job of creating this loathsome little beast beyond 2 dimensions, because we can clearly understand how he came to be this awful through the treatment that he gets by the upper servants, but like absolutely his mom. Even if we don't agree with the adults at Gateshead Hall that his behavior is excusable, we can absolutely see how he came to be who he is, or how he is. In the next chapter, God bless Jane. I resisted all the way. Like, I would totally be one of those weirdos that I don't do needle pointing. I like embroidery, but I would totally make a shirt, or probably a shirt or a little wall hanging that says, I resisted all the way, Jane Eyre. Because that's right. I'm so proud of her for doing that. She was terrified, and she understood the situation she was in, getting to chapter 2. I also really do love Bessie because she sees Jane for who Jane is, and she's always giving her the benefit of the doubt. She's tactful in how she chides Jane because she never outright blames her for any of the bullshit, but she tries to communicate to Jane in a very conscientious way and urging her to be more aware. She knows Jane has to grow up much faster than the other children because of her place, and I suspect that she sees much of herself in Jane. Miss Abbott, on the other hand, is a miserable bitch. After Jane gets her ass handed to her by John and then by Miss Abbott, she's condemned to the dreaded Red Room. So I want to take a moment to read a sentence that I very much appreciated. I need to get better. I need to get better about my language. Okay. I absolutely adore a long and lovely sentence, the kind of sentence that's frowned upon by today's standards. It sings to me. It really does. I love seeing a long sentence. Long lost are the days of a sentence that takes up an entire paragraph to itself. We can battle all we want, but it's my opinion that writing sentences like this nowadays, even if they're grammatically sound, you will be frowned upon and encouraged to shorten your passage, because I guess we're catering to the spirit of brevity, and You know, it has its place. I love me a Claire Keegan story. But I feel like we're kind of catering to shorter and shorter attention spans. And so it makes me want to go the opposite direction. Let the children get bored, I say. Okay, so this is Jane's perspective of the Red Room, the dreaded Red Room, on page 8 on the 3rd paragraph of this particular copy. It would be different maybe in another book. So yeah, so as Jane muses about one of the largest and stateliest chambers in the mansion, she says this: a bed supported on massive pillars of mahogany, hung with curtains of deep red damask, stood out like a tabernacle in the center. Woo. Tabernacle. Yeah.
Tabernacle.
Okay, I'm going to start over. A bed supported on massive pillars of mahogany, hung with curtains of deep red damask, stood out like a tabernacle in the center. The 2 large windows, with their blinds always drawn down, were half shrouded in festoons and falls of similar drapery. The carpet was red. The table at the foot of the bed was covered with a crimson cloth. The walls were a soft fawn color with a blush of pink in it. The wardrobe, the toilet table, the chairs were all of darkly polished old mahogany. That was all one sentence. See? One sentence. And it's beautiful. And it gives you so much information. And it's a long sentence. Maybe I have a thing for long sentences. I don't know. I'll look into this. Out of these deep surroundings, shades rose high and glared white the piled up mattresses and pillows of the bed, spread with a snowy Marseille counterpane. Scarcely less prominent was an ample, cushioned easy chair near the head of the bed, also white, with a footstool before it and looking, as I thought, like a pale throne, which is very ghastly and ghostly. I must say Jane's rapid descent into irrational fear of the room itself is a lovely morsel of Gothic horror. And even if I found myself giggling at her train of thought, she was terrified. Poor thing. It's understandable. Mr. Reed, her uncle, was dead for 9 years, practically the entire time Jane has been alive. And the thought of him dying in that room, laid out afterwards, and the fact that nobody ever really went into that room unless absolutely necessary is enough to fuel any 10-year-old's imagination to the point of hysteria. I also wanted to point out how Charlotte Brontë uses Jane's reflection in the mirror as a means of setting the tone of this chapter and the state of mind Jane is in at that point. She also uses it to develop the world and Jane. It's great. She doesn't use it as a lazy excuse to describe Jane's features, as that's like one of the novice writers' big no-nos, is to have your character look in a mirror and describe their features so that the reader knows what they look like. I mean, obviously, Charlotte Bronte's not doing that, but she uses this moment where Jane sees her reflection to show Jane's skewed perception of herself, but her skewed perception of the world, but also her skewed perception of the world in that moment too. I also anyway. She depicts her as almost phantom-like herself, half fairy, half imp, which is an interesting peek into the Victorian era ideas about life after death and spiritualism and fairies, because up to that point in that time period, fairies were never depicted as little sprites with gauzy wings and childlike features. But in the imagination of a 10-year-old in 1848, it's perfect. It's good stuff. Because I love the glimpse that we get into the time period, even if the story itself is purely fiction. Paragraph 4, page 10. I wanted to point this out. Here's where Jane is. She's been crying. She's upset. She was beat up by her cousin, got blamed for it, got thrown in the red room. She's freaking out. She thinks there's ghosts. She thinks she looks like an imp or a fairy, and so now something's going to come from the chimney and steal her. She's freaking the fuck out, and she's sitting in timeout. So she says, What a consternation of soul was mine that dreary afternoon, how all my brain was in tumult, and all my heart in insurrection. Yet, in what darkness, what dense ignorance was the mental battle fought! I could not answer the ceaseless inward question, why thus I suffered. Now at that distance of I will not say how many years, I see it clearly. So she has this epiphany while she's while she's going through this. She's freaked out about her uncle's ghost coming and chiding her for sure, because it's his family that doesn't like her and it doesn't accept her. But she knows, she feels like on some level that the ghost of her uncle would see everything, would know that she's not a bad girl, and even if he came to console her in that moment, it still would be a completely mortifying experience for her. So she's just freaking out. So she's having this epiphany as to why she's there, why she's going through what she's going through, but there's like no rationale there for her at this point, because she's going off the deep end. And I feel like it cuts deep because she's asking herself, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why me? Why? And it all sort of just kind of hits her in one blow. But this is a lifetime of feeling this way. Even though she's 10, she is still very wise beyond her years, regardless of what prose and vocabulary and language that Charlotte Brontë uses to tell the story from her perspective. It's third person limited, right? Yeah, so the death of her parents happened right before her uncle died. So her dad died, her mom died, and then her uncle died. And so she's always been raised by her aunt. And so she's really only ever known a life of adversity, even in a wealthy family. Clearly, she is conditioned to fear for her place and to form a tough exterior, when really all she needs is love and affection. And it's really sad, even though in the scene you're going through this roller coaster of emotions, because you feel for her, you understand that she's scared, but you're also, at least from an adult or older perspective, you're kind of laughing at how she's freaking out and creating all of this in her head. But at the end, you just want to hold her. And I think in a lot of ways Bessie does too, and she would get in trouble if she showed Jane any sort of affection. So it's a really tough situation. I also wanted to point out her descriptions of John Reed's behavior are absolutely the makings of a serial killer. He's like the John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer of the Victorian era. Like, it's not Jack the Ripper, it's John the Ripper, John Reed the Ripper. Here's my supporting evidence. Page 10, paragraph 1. Yeah, page 10, paragraph 1. John no one thwarted, much less punished, though he twisted the necks of pigeons, though he twisted the necks of pigeons, killed the little pea chicks, set the dogs at the sheep, stripped the hothouse vines of their fruit, oh, that would piss me off, and broke the buds off the choicest plants in the conservatory. Can we just take a moment? They had a freaking conservatory. They had a hothouse and a conservatory. Well, the red room is one of the stateliest chambers in the mansion. So they're in the mansion, you would have a conservatory. Anyway, I would love to have a conservatory or a greenhouse. Oh my God. Anyway, he called his mother old girl too, and sometimes reviled her for her dark skin, similar to his own, bluntly disregarded her wishes, not infrequently tore and spoiled her silk attire, and he was still her own darling. Jane is livid, but at this point in time, she's completely defeated. Jane was onto something with this little POS when she said he was a murderer in the making. And the poor thing had to suffer his bullshit, I swear to God. What I just read you, that passage, that was also one sentence. Anyway, on top of all that, Abbott had her convinced that she, Jane, was such a stain on the family that she might be even taken away by punishing spirits. And Jane wondered if the ghost of her uncle might appear to her right then and there. Poor thing, no wonder she had a panic attack. So that's what happens. She sees like a flash of light from like a lantern or something outside the window, but it flashes into the room, and like her brain, she's like, oh, I recognize that is not a supernatural thing, but she, in her state, she flips out, thinks it's a ghost or some like, yeah, she thinks it's a ghost, and passes out. We get to chapter 3, and I wanted to say how I love the little details woven together to paint an ever painful picture of Jane's state of mind. Bessie and Sarah, another servant, are probably more on Jane's side than Jane realizes. Bessie and Sarah sleep in the nursery with Jane that night after she's been visited by the apothecary. Jane is tired. She's not sleeping very well. She's still freaked out. She had a freaking panic attack. She's listening to Bessie and Sarah kind of at night until they fell asleep, and they're talking about ghosts and all kinds of supernatural things. And so of course that doesn't help Jane at all. I think it's cool because we can see how Bessie, and not Sarah so much because she's really only serves to be in that scene right so far, but we can see how Bessie is genuinely disturbed by Jane's experience, her episode in the Red Room. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, but like I felt like it was another like nice little morsel of the culture back then. Spiritualism, as I said before, was a movement that was probably at its height when this book was published and written and published. And specifically in 1948, word of the Fox sisters' rappings in New York were exploding across the world at that point. So I will painfully refrain from going on a side quest with all of that, but be sure I absolutely love this bit of history in tandem with Jane Eyre and Bessie's talk with Sarah about spirits, because it 100% grounds you in the world and the time period. I also couldn't help but think of the story, the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper by Gilman. Charlotte, is it Charlotte Perkins? Let me see. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, another Charlotte. It was written in the same time period, Victorian era, and it made me think of how the protagonist falls into a state of insanity. Not that I'm saying Jane is going through postpartum psychosis, but being diagnosed with a nervous condition that particular protagonist in The Yellow Wallpaper was diagnosed with. It made me think of Jane and her behavior that she was displaying. It was very much like a healthy case of the blues, and that could very well have been diagnosed as a nervous depressive condition had she seen the family's physician. But since Mrs. Reed is a see you next Tuesday, right? Jane is seen by an apothecary. She's not good enough to be seen by the family physician, but I think that was a blessing in disguise, because he essentially sets in motion a huge change for Jane and spares her a fate better than the Perkins protagonist, because not to say that she would go off the deep end the way the Yellow Wallpaper girl did, but if a physician came and diagnosed her with that, who knows what she would be dealing with, especially in that family. I don't think that Mrs. Reed would have treated the situation appropriately, but anyway. I also wanted to point out how Jane perceived poor folk and that of her father's family, because she was raised in a wealthy family where people of this economic stature absolutely detest economically challenged individuals. Her aunt Jane branded her father's family as beggars. So poor little Jane would rather suffer a worse fate than that of finding people from the poor side of her family to care for her, even if they were good people. But she felt that being poor was so terrible that poor people couldn't be nice. And she saw being poor, and she says, she saw being poor as synonymous with degradation. And she tells Mr. Lloyd, the apothecary, no. Oh, no, she doesn't say it. This is what she's thinking. Okay. Yeah, she says being poor is synonymous with degradation. And no, I was not heroic enough to purchase liberty at the price of castle. She'd rather be an outcast in her own home than go a-begging. I really liked the exposition that Charlotte Brontë used in this chapter, where she has Jane overhearing Abbott gossiping about her family to Bessie. So we discovered Jane's mother was rich and her father was poor. And Jane's mother married for love. And her father, Jane's grandfather, Jane's mom's dad, he was pissed off that she married him. She married the poor guy. So he cut her off of the family fortune and basically disowned her. So Jane's mom stayed with her dad, and where he was working, typhus fever was rampant. So he got sick, died, infected mom, she died, and then that's it. Jane was an orphan, and her uncle was taking care of her. And then on his deathbed, he asked his wife, who is Mrs. Reed, to take care of Jane and treat her as her own, which she absolutely doesn't do. And it's terrible. And she's going to burn in hell for that. Anyway, yeah, you know what? Jane's mom's a real one for doing that. For not only, like, following her heart and marrying for love, but she gave up her riches for that. That's love. That's a down-ass bitch. So poor Jane has no inheritance, and how could she not be in a state of distress? And even with Bessie having her back, it's still a rough hand. But luckily, Mr. Lloyd, the apothecary, plants a seed in Jane's head about school. And I wanted to read this because I thought it was cute, and the little girl in me, like, really, this passage spoke to the little girl in me too. So he says, would you like to go to school? Again, I reflected. I scarcely knew what school was. Bessie sometimes spoke of it as a place where young ladies sat in the stocks, wore backboards, and were expected to be exceedingly genteel and precise. John Reed hated his school, and he abused his master. But John Reed's tastes were no rule for mine. And if Bessie's accounts of school discipline, gathered from the young ladies of a family where she had lived before coming to Gateshead, were somewhat appalling, her details of certain accomplishments attained by these same young ladies were, I thought, equally attractive. Yeah. She boasted of beautiful paintings of landscapes and flowers by them executed, of songs they could sing and pieces they could play, of purses they could net, of French books they could translate, till my spirit was moved to emulation as I listened. Besides, school would be a complete change. It implied a long journey, an entire separation from Gateshead, an entrance into a new life. I should indeed like to go to school, was the audible conclusion of my musings. So very cute. I'm so much with Jane on this one, and I hate to say it, but I feel like Escape is not going to come out with its caveats. I know I've read a little bit farther ahead, but not much farther ahead to really feel the full potential wrath that could come somehow, some way, in some situation. It's totally not Jane's fault. In the next 10 or so chapters, I can see it happening. But anyway, that's this segment. And since this video is long enough, I think I will just break off the Jane Eyre videos every 3 chapters. So this will end up being a playlist, and if there's anything I didn't cover, if there's anything you want to share in the comments below, I would appreciate it. And thank you for listening, and thank you for allowing me to go through my script and add certain things with my script. I hope that I'll get better with this. I'm sure I'll get better with this. This is technically my 3rd video. So thanks until the next 3 chapters.